The fire that destroyed the Harrove plantation on the night of August 14, 1859, burned so fiercely that witnesses said they could see the glow from 12 miles away. By morning, nothing remained but ash and the skeletal frames of 3 buildings. 17 people died that night, 16 enslaved workers and 1 white overseer. The official report filed by the county sheriff 3 days later blamed the fire on an overturned lantern in the tobacco barn. But the enslaved survivors told a different story, one they whispered only to each other, one that involved a young deaf man named Thomas, a cruel overseer named Virgil Crenshaw, and a chain of events so deliberate, so carefully planned that even today, historians studying it can't agree on exactly what happened. What they do agree on is this: someone set that fire on purpose. Someone wanted those people dead, and someone walked away without a single burn mark on their body. Before we continue with the story of Thomas and the night that changed everything, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from the South or anywhere in America where old plantations still stand, leave a comment telling me what state you're from. These stories are part of our history, uncomfortable as they are, and I want to know where you're hearing this from. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button, because the story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, revenge, and survival. Now let's return to Virginia in 1859, to a place where cruelty was law and silence had become the deadliest weapon of all. The Harrove plantation sat in the Tidewater region of Virginia, about 40 miles south of Richmond, in a county where the James River split into dozens of smaller tributaries feeding the marshlands and tobacco fields. It was old Virginia country, settled in the early 1700s by English families who had come seeking fortune in the New World. By 1859, the land had been worked for more than a century. The soil was worn in some places, still fertile in others, a patchwork of productivity that decided which families prospered and which slowly fell into Gentile poverty. The Harrove family was somewhere in the middle. They weren't wealthy like the Randolphs or the Carters, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people, but they weren't poor either. Edmund Harrove's grandfather had bought the land in 1732 with money earned from a shipping business in Norfolk. He built the main house himself, or more accurately, supervised the enslaved workers who built it. A modest 2-story house of brick and wood, painted white, with a wide porch facing east to catch the morning sun and the evening river breeze. The plantation itself covered about 300 acres, with roughly half under cultivation at any time. The rest was left alone, used for timber, or allowed to return to the pine forests and marshlands that had covered the region before Europeans arrived. Tobacco was the main crop, though corn, wheat, and vegetables grew in smaller plots near the slave cabins. Behind the main house was an orchard of apple and peach trees, and a small vineyard that Edmund's father had planted in a fit of hopefulness, though it never produced much. The grapes grew, but they were sour and thin-skinned, better suited for vinegar than wine. In 1859, the plantation was worked by 23 enslaved people, ages ranging from 6 to 62. They lived in 6 cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the tobacco barns, each housing 3 to 5 people depending on family size. The cabins were made of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, with dirt floors that turned to mud in the rain, and wooden shutters instead of glass windows. Each cabin had a single fireplace for cooking and warmth, and a loft where children slept on straw mattresses. The enslaved community at Harrove Plantation was relatively stable compared to others nearby. Edmund Harrove did not usually sell people away from their families unless forced by financial trouble, which happened once in 1851 when a bad tobacco crop and poor investments made him sell 3 young men to a trader heading south. The memory of that sale still haunted the quarters. The mother's wails, the sight of men chained together and led down the road toward Richmond, it had been a reminder that their lives were not their own, that at any moment they could be torn apart by forces beyond their control. But for the most part, life at Harrove followed a predictable rhythm. Work was hard. Tobacco demanded constant attention from planting in April to harvest in September, but it was no harder than neighboring plantations. Food rations were sufficient if monotonous: cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and whatever vegetables they could grow in small garden plots. Clothing was issued twice a year, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 jacket, 1 pair of shoes for men, 2 dresses, 1 shawl, 1 pair of shoes for women. Children wore hand-me-downs until they were old enough to work in the fields. Edmund Harrov was a widower in his late 50s. His wife had died in childbirth 20 years earlier, along with the infant son who would have been his only heir. He never remarried, perhaps because he loved his wife deeply, or perhaps because he had grown tired of domestic life. He spent most of his time in Richmond, where he owned a townhouse on Grey Street and held a seat on the board of a small bank. He visited the plantation once a month, sometimes less, to review accounts and inspect crops. He was not cruel by the standards of his time, but neither was he especially kind. He saw slavery as an economic system, a necessary evil, and treated the enslaved people like his horses or farm equipment, as valuable property that needed upkeep. Day-to-day management fell to the overseer. For 2 years before Virgil Crenshaw arrived, the overseer was William Porter, a local farmer's son who was competent but unambitious. Porter kept the plantation running, but tobacco yields were declining steadily, and Edmund Harrov grew frustrated. In spring 1857, he dismissed Porter and hired Crenshaw, recommended by a neighboring planter who wanted to be rid of him but was too polite to say so. Virgil Crenshaw was 32 when he arrived, a tall, lean man with pale blue eyes and a face incapable of smiling. Born in North Carolina, the youngest son of a small farmer who lost his land when Crenshaw was 15, he had worked from field hand to overseer over 15 years, moving from plantation to plantation across Virginia and the Carolinas, rarely staying more than 2 years. There was always a reason for the moves: disputes with owners, incidents with the enslaved, sudden employment needs. But the pattern was clear. Crenshaw left destruction wherever he went. Among the enslaved communities, his reputation traveled faster than he did, carried through Sunday markets, traveling preachers, hired out workers, and songs encoding warnings. The stories said Crenshaw enjoyed his work too much, took pleasure in exercising power, and saw the people under his control not as humans, but as animals to be broken. When he arrived at Harrov in April 1857, he spent the first week observing. He walked the fields, inspected barns and outbuildings, studied the records, and most importantly, watched the people. He noted who worked hard, who slacked, who had influence, who was isolated, who had family ties to exploit. He took mental notes that he would later use to build a system of control through fear, manipulation, and strategic violence. His first official act as overseer was to call a meeting of all the enslaved workers on a Sunday afternoon. They gathered in the yard between the tobacco barns, men, women, and children, standing in the spring sunshine, while Crenshaw spoke from the porch of his cottage. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but with an edge that made people's skin crawl. "My name is Virgil Crenshaw," he said. "I am the new overseer of this plantation. I want to make a few things clear. I don't care what rules were here before. Those are gone. From now on, you follow my rules. My rules are simple. Work hard, work fast, and don't give me trouble. Do those 3 things and we'll get along. Don't, and you'll regret it. I don't make empty threats and I don't give second chances. Do we understand each other?" No one answered. They stood silent, knowing any response could be seen as defiance. Crenshaw smiled, a thin, humorless expression that never reached his eyes. "Good. Now go back to your cabins. Tomorrow we start fresh." That night in their cabins, the enslaved people spoke quietly about the new overseer. They had seen men like him before, men who wore cruelty like a badge of honor. They knew what was coming: the increased work quotas, the random punishments, the constant surveillance, and the ever-present fear. What they didn't yet realize was just how far Crenshaw would push them, or how long they would have to endure his control. Within 6 months, Crenshaw had reshaped the plantation entirely. He reorganized the work schedules, grouping the enslaved workers by age and strength, assigning each group specific tasks and daily quotas they had to meet. He set up a system of punishments for anyone who failed to meet these quotas. Food rations were reduced, extra labor assigned, confinement in the plantation jail, a small windowless shed behind the overseer's cottage. For more serious offenses, talking back, trying to escape, striking another enslaved person, the punishments were even harsher. Crenshaw made sure never to harm anyone so badly that they couldn't work, because he knew his worth to Edmund Hargrove was in extracting maximum labor while minimizing financial loss. Crenshaw's real skill, if it could be called that, was not in physical force, but in psychological manipulation. He had a knack for spotting each person's weaknesses and exploiting them precisely. He could tell who had children they would do anything to protect, who had a lover they couldn't bear to see hurt, who had pride that could be shattered, who had hope that could be snuffed out. He used this knowledge to create an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, where people were afraid to help each other, afraid to show vulnerability, afraid to act in ways that might attract his attention. One of his preferred methods was turning people against one another. He would tell someone that another person had reported them, true or not, and then watch as suspicion and anger destroyed friendships and family bonds. He would grant small privileges to certain people, like extra food, lighter work, or permission to visit a spouse on a neighboring plantation, and then ensure everyone else knew about it, breeding jealousy and division. He punished entire groups for the actions of a single individual, forcing people to police each other out of fear of collective consequences. Under Crenshaw's management, tobacco yields soared. First full year, 1858, the plantation produced 30% more than the year before. Edmund Hargrove was pleased. He gave Crenshaw a bonus and told him to continue the good work. He never asked how the results were achieved, nor did he want to know. But there was one person Crenshaw could not figure out. One person seemed immune to his usual tactics, someone who watched him with eyes that held neither fear nor defiance, only a quiet, calculating awareness. That person was Thomas. Thomas was born on the Harrow plantation in spring 1841, the son of Ruth, a cook in the main house. His father was unknown. Ruth had never said, and no one asked. In the world of slavery, parentage could be dangerous, leading to violence, separation, or worse. What mattered was that Thomas was Ruth's son, and she loved him with a fierce protectiveness that only deepened over the years. Thomas had been deaf from birth, caused by a fever Ruth had during the last months of her pregnancy. She had collapsed over a hot stove in the main house kitchen one July day. The plantation doctor, a white man from Richmond who visited monthly, diagnosed heat exhaustion and prescribed rest. But Ruth could not afford rest. She had work to do, and if she didn't do it, she would be replaced. She returned to work the next day, and the fever lingered until Thomas was born 6 weeks later. He was a small, quiet baby, and Ruth feared for his life at first. But he survived, growing stronger each day, healthy in every way except one: he could not hear. Ruth realized it when Thomas was about 3 months old. He did not startle at loud sounds, did not turn when called, did not cry when other babies in the quarters cried. At first she hoped she was mistaken, but by 6 months there was no doubt. Thomas was deaf. In some places, a deaf child might be seen as a burden, someone unable to contribute to the plantation's work, and therefore worthless. But Ruth was valuable, an excellent cook relied on by Edmund Harrove's father for meals for important guests, and so Thomas was allowed to live and grow like any other child in the quarters. Ruth ensured he learned to work and be useful, so no one could call him worthless. As a child, Thomas developed his own system of communication. He could not hear words, but he could read faces, gestures, and expressions. Ruth and Thomas created a language of signs, simple at first, pointing, nodding, shaking heads, but it became more complex as he grew. By 5, they could hold full conversations with hands and faces alone. Others in the quarters learned some of these signs too, enough to convey basic messages. Thomas also learned to read lips accurately, watching mouths move and understanding speech without sound. His deafness shaped his life in unexpected ways. Because he could not hear orders across the fields, he worked closer to the main buildings, in the tobacco barns, curing sheds, carpenter's shop, and blacksmith's forge. This meant he often worked alone or with a few others, giving him unusual independence. It also meant he overheard conversations people thought he could not understand. White people often spoke freely around him, assuming deafness meant ignorance. They were wrong. Thomas became extremely observant, reading faces, lips, gestures, and posture. He learned secrets that others never discovered, overhearing things spoken aloud because people forgot he was present. By 1859, at 18, Thomas was a young man of medium height, with his mother's cheekbones and dark eyes, lean and strong from years of labor. He inherited her intelligence and had a rare quality, a patient watchfulness, the ability to observe and think before acting. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it softened his face, making him appear younger and more vulnerable than you. Crenshaw tried in his first months to break Thomas like he broke everyone else. He gave him impossible tasks, like moving a pile of bricks back and forth for no reason other than to show power. He withheld Thomas's food, falsely accusing him of stealing from the kitchen. He even threatened to sell Ruth to a plantation in Georgia, knowing separation was a potent tool of control. Thomas endured. He moved the bricks twice without complaint. He went 3 days without food without showing weakness. When Crenshaw threatened his mother, Thomas met his gaze steadily, neither defiant nor submissive, just patient and watchful. Crenshaw was unsettled. There was something in Thomas's silence, in the way he observed without reacting, that made the overseer feel exposed, as if Thomas could see through all his strategies to the insecure, violent man beneath. Crenshaw had faced defiance before. He knew how to crush it. But Thomas wasn't defiant. He was something else entirely, calculating, which made him dangerous. The turning point came on a hot Tuesday in late July. The temperature had been above 90 degrees for days, the humidity oppressive, making work exhausting. The tobacco plants wilted despite watering, and the enslaved workers moved slowly, conserving energy. Thomas was in the tobacco barn, hanging leaves to cure. The barn was hotter than the fields, thick with the sweet cloying smell of tobacco. He preferred it to the fields because he could work at his own pace, mostly alone, without Crenshaw hovering, criticizing, or finding fault. He was on a ladder near the back, hanging a bundle on a high rack, when he noticed movement near the door. He glanced down and saw Crenshaw enter, followed by a young woman named Sarah. She was 19, the daughter of the plantation blacksmith, Jacob, one of the most respected enslaved men on the property. Sarah had inherited her father's strength and quiet dignity. She was 7 months pregnant, her belly visible beneath a loose dress, and she moved with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman carrying a heavy burden. Her husband, Daniel, worked in the fields and would not return until sunset. Thomas watched as Crenshaw closed the barn door behind them. There was something in the overseer's movements, in his expression, that made Thomas's stomach tightened with fear. He stayed very still on the ladder, partly hidden by the hanging tobacco leaves, and watched. Crenshaw spoke to Sarah. Thomas couldn't see his lips clearly from this angle, but he could see Sarah's expression, and what he saw made his blood run cold. She looked terrified. She stepped backward toward the door, but Crenshaw moved to block her path. Crenshaw spoke again, and this time Thomas could see his lips well enough to catch some words. "Been watching you since you showed some gratitude. Light work because of your condition." Sarah shook her head, her hands instinctively moving to shield her belly. She said something. Thomas couldn't see her lips clearly because her back was partly turned, but whatever she said, it angered Crenshaw. His jaw tightened, he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in so hard Thomas could see her wince. Thomas didn't think, he just acted. He climbed down the ladder as quietly as possible, his feet finding the rungs by memory, his eyes never leaving Crenshaw and Sarah. When he reached the floor, he walked across the barn silently and tapped Crenshaw on the shoulder. Crenshaw spun around, startled, still holding Sarah's arm. For a moment, the three stood there in the dusty barn light, the overseer, the pregnant woman, and the young deaf man who had just stopped something that could have ended badly for Sarah. Thomas pointed at the ladder, then at the tobacco leaves hanging from the racks, then at Crenshaw. "Here's me." Ning was clear. He needed help with the work. It was a lie, of course. Thomas didn't need help, but it gave Sarah the chance to slip away, which she did, freeing her arm and walking quickly to the door. She didn't look back. Crenshaw stared at Thomas for a long moment, his pale blue eyes full of fury. Then he smiled, a thin, humorless smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned close, so close that Thomas could smell the tobacco on his breath and see the fine lines around his eyes, the stubble on his jaw. He spoke slowly, clearly enough for Thomas to read his lips. "You just made a mistake, boy. A big one. And I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your short life." Thomas didn't respond. He just stood there, expressionless, eyes steady. After a moment, Crenshaw turned and left the barn, leaving Thomas alone in the heat and silence. That night, Sarah went to Ruth's cabin. She was crying, tears running down her face, hands shaking as she signed to Thomas, thanking him. Ruth held her while she cried, and Thomas sat near the fireplace, watching the flames, thinking about what would come next. He knew Crenshaw wouldn't let this go. Men like him never did. They couldn't allow anyone to challenge their authority, even in small ways, because their power relied on fear, and fear relied on the certainty that resistance was always punished. Thomas was right. Over the next 3 weeks, Crenshaw acted on his promise. The torment began the very next day. Thomas was sent to clean the well, a task both dangerous and disgusting. The well was about 30 feet deep, lined with slippery stones covered in moss and algae. At the bottom, 3 feet of water lay over years of mud, debris, dead leaves, animal carcasses, broken tools, things that had fallen in and never been recovered. The water had started to taste foul, and Edmund Harrov had ordered it cleaned before his next visit. Though, Mass was lowered in a wooden bucket, a rope tied around his waist as a precaution. The air below was cold, damp, and smelled of rot. He spent hours scooping mud and debris into buckets hauled to the surface, his hands numb, his back aching from the cramped space. When he finally emerged at sunset, he was filthy and shivering despite the summer heat. The next day, Crenshaw sent him to repair the roof of the tobacco barn. It was dangerous work, made worse by the heat. The tin roof could burn skin, and the steep pitch made one wrong step deadly. Thomas worked carefully, replacing broken shingles and sealing gaps with tar, trying not to think about how easy it would be to fall, how convenient it would be for Crenshaw if he did. The following day he hauled 100-pound sacks of grain from the storage shed to the mill, half a mile away. He made the trip 20 times, his shoulders screaming, legs trembling. By day's end, he could barely walk. All the while, Crenshaw watched with cold blue eyes, waiting for Thomas to break, complain, or give an excuse to punish him further. But Thomas never did. He completed every task, no matter how hard, no matter how dangerous, without a word of protest. He endured. But Crenshaw wasn't satisfied with exhausting him physically. He wanted to crush him mentally, too. He cut Thomas's food rations, claiming he had been stealing from the kitchen. It wasn't true. Ruth would never allow her son to steal, and everyone in the quarters knew it. Crenshaw didn't care. He cared only about power, showing he could take away even the basics at will. Thomas's rations were halved. Instead of a pound of cornmeal and a quarter pound of salt pork each day, he got half a pound of cornmeal and no meat. Ruth tried to share her food, but Thomas refused. He knew that if Crenshaw found out, she would be punished too. He couldn't bear that. He grew thinner, his face scowl, eyes sinking deeper. But he kept working, enduring, watching Crenshaw with a patient, calculating gaze that unnerved the overseer. The other enslaved people observed this mix of sympathy and fear. They knew what Thomas had done. Word spread quickly about how he had saved Sarah from Crenshaw's advances. They admired his courage but feared for him. They knew Crenshaw would never stop, always pushing until Thomas broke or died. Interfering would only worsen matters. Sarah was filled with guilt. She knew Thomas suffered because of her, because he protected her. She wanted to help but didn't know how. Her husband Daniel was furious but also terrified. Confront Crenshaw, and he might be killed. Then what would happen to Sarah and their unborn child? Jacob, Sarah's father, was more practical. A skilled blacksmith in his 50s, on the plantation since he was a teen, he had seen overseers come and go. He had learned survival meant keeping your head down, doing your work and waiting. Overseers never lasted forever. Eventually they left, were fired, or died. But even Jacob worried about Thomas. The young man was strong, but everyone had a breaking point, and Crenshaw seemed determined to find his. 3 weeks after the barn incident, Crenshaw escalated. He declared Thomas would be whipped for insubordination. The charge was absurd. Thomas had never spoken a word to him. He had only done every task assigned. Crenshaw didn't need a real reason. He only needed an excuse. The whipping was set for Saturday afternoon in the yard between the tobacco barns, where everyone could watch. It was meant as a lesson, a warning. Ruth was frantic with fear and anger. She went to the main house, pleading with Edmund Harrov, who was visiting, to intervene. But Harrov refused. Crenshaw was the overseer, he said. Discipline was his responsibility. He didn't want to undermine his authority. Ruth left in tears, knowing she could do nothing. But Saturday morning brought the unexpected. Crenshaw awoke with a sudden fever. One moment fine, the next burning, shivering despite the heat, his head pounding, stomach churning. He spent the day in bed, too ill to get up, too sick to carry out the whipping. By Sunday the fever had broken, and Crenshaw felt better, but confused. He couldn't understand where it had come from or why it ended so quickly. He suspected poisoning but had no proof, no idea who could have done it. He didn't know that Ruth had slipped a small amount of ipac root into his coffee on Friday night. A plant from the woods near the plantation, prepared carefully. Ruth had learned from her mother how to use plants for medicine. The ipac made Crenshaw violently ill but didn't kill him. Ruth had been careful with the dosage. She didn't want him dead only to buy Thomas more time, but time was short. Crenshaw was more determined than ever to break Thomas, and was beginning to suspect someone in the quarters of opposing him. Surveillance increased. The plantation atmosphere grew even more suffocating. People were afraid to speak, afraid to meet each other's eyes, afraid of being accused of things they hadn't done. And Thomas, in the middle of all this, was changing. The other enslaved people could see it, in the way he endured, the way he held himself, patient and watchful, unbroken despite everything. The way he moved, the way he looked at Crenshaw when the overseer's back was turned. There was a coldness in Thomas's eyes now, a sharp calculation that hadn't been there before. He was no longer simply enduring, he was planning. Ruth was the first to notice the change in her son. She had always been able to read Thomas better than anyone else. She had raised him, taught him, protected him for 18 years. She knew his moods, his thoughts, his fears, and she Faye. LT with a mother's instinct that something had shifted deep inside him. It was a Sunday evening in mid-August, about 3 weeks after the incident in the tobacco barn. The sun was setting, coloring the sky in deep shades of orange and red, and the air was finally cooling after another scorching day. Ruth found Thomas sitting outside his cabin, staring across the yard at the overseer's cottage. There was something in the intensity of his gaze, the stillness of his body, that made her uneasy. She sat down beside him on the wooden step and took his hand. For a moment, they just sat there quietly, watching the light fade from the sky. Then Ruth turned Thomas's face toward hers and signed to him, using the gestures they had shared over the years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her hands moving slowly, carefully. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he signed back, his movements deliberate and steady. "Fire," he said. "I'm thinking about fire." Ruth felt a chill run through her despite the warm evening air. She knew her son. She knew he wasn't speaking metaphorically. She knew that when Thomas said fire, he meant it literally. "Don't," she signed, her hands trembling slightly. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. They'll kill you." Thomas shook his head. "They'll kill me anyway," he signed. "Crenshaw won't stop until I'm dead or broken. You know that—" Ruth wanted to argue, but she couldn't. She had seen too many people crushed by men like Crenshaw. She had seen too many die from overwork, from punishment, from despair. And she knew her son was right. Crenshaw would never stop. Men like him never did. They couldn't, because their power depended on fear, and fear depended on the certainty that resistance would always be punished, always destroyed. "What are you going to do?" she signed, though she feared the answer. Thomas looked back. Kay, at the overseer's cottage. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Crenshaw was inside, probably eating, probably drinking his whiskey, probably planning new torments for tomorrow. "I don't know yet," Thomas signed, "but I'll think of something." Over the next few days, Thomas did think. He turned the idea over in his mind constantly, examining it from every side, looking for flaws, risks, things that could go wrong. The more he considered it, the more he realized that what he was contemplating wasn't just dangerous. It could be catastrophic, but he also knew he had no choice. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and no one else could do it. The law wouldn't protect him. Edmund Hargrove wouldn't protect him. The other enslaved people couldn't without putting themselves in danger. He was alone in this, and that meant he had to act alone. The plan that formed in Thomas's mind was simple in concept, but complicated in execution. Crenshaw had to die. That much was clear. But it couldn't look like murder. It had to seem like an accident, something that would raise no suspicion toward Thomas or anyone else. And it had to happen in a way that made proof impossible. Fire was the answer. Fire was common on plantations, lanterns overturned, sparks from the forge, lightning strikes during summer storms, spontaneous combustion in curing tobacco barns. A fire in the barn would seem normal, and if Crenshaw happened to be inside when it began, if he were trapped, if he died, it would be a tragedy but not a crime. The challenge was getting Crenshaw into the barn at the right moment and ensuring the fire spread fast enough so he couldn't escape. Thomas watched Crenshaw's routines for days, noting when he made his rounds, when he was alone, when he was vulnerable. He also considered the consequences. If it worked, Crenshaw would die and Thomas would be free. But 17 other people worked and lived on tea. He plantation, and a fire could easily reach other buildings. Thomas didn't want to hurt innocent people. He didn't want to destroy homes or livelihoods. But he saw no other way. Crenshaw had to be stopped, and this was the only plan with a chance of success. He decided to set the fire late at night when most people were asleep and to start it so anyone nearby could escape if it spread. It wasn't perfect. Too many variables, too many things could go wrong. But it was the best plan he could devise. Thomas wasn't the only one thinking about fire. Marcus, about 30, a field worker, had been sold to the plantation from North Carolina after his previous owner died. He was quiet, reserved, kept to himself, but he noticed everything and understood the power dynamics at play. Marcus had been watching Thomas endure Crenshaw's cruelty, how he had never broken or complained, never given the overseer satisfaction. Marcus admired that. Marcus also recognized in Thomas a determination he saw in himself, a willingness to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost. Marcus hated Crenshaw for his own reasons. The overseer had singled him out, assigning the hardest work, cutting his rations, threatening to sell him away from the woman he loved, Esther, who worked in the main house. Marcus had thought of killing Crenshaw himself, but every idea, poison, a knife, an accident in the fields, was too obvious. He would be caught, tried, executed, and Esther would be left alone. Then Marcus noticed Thomas staring at the tobacco barn. He saw the look in Thomas's eyes and understood. Thomas was planning something, and it involved fire. Marcus decided to wait and watch. If Thomas succeeded, Marcus wouldn't risk his life. If not, he would have to act later. There was also Hannah, about 25, a kitchen worker who had grown up on the plantation. She had always been protective of Thomas, like an older sister. She had watched his persecution with anger and fear, thinking of ways to help him. She didn't know Thomas's plan or Marcus's thoughts, but she also considered fire. She had been thinking about it for weeks since seeing Crenshaw corner Sarah in the barn. She had wanted to intervene but was too afraid. Then Thomas had appeared, and Sarah escaped. Hannah felt relief and shame, relief that Sarah was safe, shame for her fear. Hannah knew the barn was full of dry, flammable materials. She knew a fire would spread quickly and be deadly if Crenshaw were inside, and she knew no one would suspect her, a kitchen worker with no reason to be near the barn. She was still planning the details when Thomas acted. On the evening of August 13th, Thomas saw his chance. Crenshaw had been drinking more than usual, sitting on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, watching people return from the fields, making notes in his small leather book. Thomas, working late in the carpenter shop, watched him stumble as he returned to his cottage around 9 o'clock. Thomas waited until the plantation was quiet, the last lamps extinguished in cabins and main house. Edmund Hargrove was in Richmond, leaving only 2 elderly women in the main house to sleep. The nearly full moon cast a pale light over the yard and buildings. Thomas could see clearly as he walked silently across the yard to the tobacco barn. He had made this walk 1,000 times, knew every rut, stone, shadow, and sound. But tonight felt different. Tonight he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. He reached the barn and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned softly, a noise that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Thomas froze, listening, but there was no reply, no that anyone had noticed. He slipped inside and shut the door behind him. The barn was dark, but Thomas's eyes adjusted quickly. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls, forming stripes of silver light across the floor. The smell of tobacco was strong, sweet, and heavy, mixed with dust and old wood. Thousands of tobacco leaves hung from racks overhead, drying in the warm air, rustling softly in the breeze coming through the gaps in the walls. Thomas moved through the barn with the ease of someone who had spent countless hours here. He knew where every tool was kept, where every pile of supplies was stacked, and where every danger lay. He went to the back of the barn, the storage area where Crenor kept tools, rope, and other items. The space was messy and chaotic, full of things thrown there and forgotten, old rags soaked in oil, dried straw used for packing, broken wood, empty barrels, coils of rope. It was a fire hazard, and everyone knew it, but nobody had bothered to tidy it up. Crenor didn't care about safety. He only cared about getting work done. Thomas worked quickly and quietly, his hands moving with trained precision. He piled the oil-soaked rags against the back wall under one of the main support beams. He scattered straw around them, making a bed of kindling. He placed broken pieces of wood so that it would create a chimney effect, pulling flames upward toward the dried tobacco leaves above. He was setting a fire that would start slowly but spread fast, a fire almost impossible to stop once it began. Then he took a lantern from a hook near the door, lit it with a match from the box Crenor kept in the storage area, and set it carefully near the pile of rags. He adjusted the wick so it burned hot, then tipped the lantern slightly so oil began leaking, forming a small puddle on the floor. It would take time for the fire to ignite. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30, depending on how fast the oil spread and how hot the lantern burned. Long enough for Thomas to be far away when it happened. Long enough to seem like an accident. A lantern left burning, oil spilling, a careless mistake anyone could make. But Thomas wasn't done. He needed Crenor in the barn when the fire started, and for that he needed a lure. He left the barn and walked to the overseer's cottage. The windows were dark. Crenor had gone to bed, probably passed out from the whiskey. Thomas picked up a small stone from the ground and threw it at the window, hard enough to make a sharp crack. He waited. Nothing. He threw another, then another, each one hitting the glass like a gunshot in the quiet night. Finally, a lamp flickered on inside. Thomas saw Crenor's silhouette move past the window, tall and thin, swaying slightly. A moment later, the door opened, and Crenor stepped onto the porch, holding a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. He wore only pants and an undershirt, barefoot, hair messy. "Who's there?" he slurred, his voice thick with whiskey. "Show yourself, or I'll shoot." Thomas stepped into the lantern light, hands raised to show he was unarmed. He pointed toward the tobacco barn, making frantic gestures, his face twisted in panic, his mouth moving like he was speaking, but no words came. Crenor squinted at him, confused. "What? What are you trying to say, boy?" Thomas pointed again, more urgently, then started walking toward the barn. He looked back, signaling Crenor to follow, gestures frantic and desperate. Crenor hesitated. He was drunk and suspicious, and he didn't trust Thomas. But he ran the plantation in Edmund Harrow's absence. If there was trouble in the tobacco barn, if crops were damaged, if someone was stealing, if there was fire, he would be responsible. He couldn't ignore a warning, even from someone he hated. "This better not be a trick," he muttered, following Thomas across the yard. He kept his pistol aimed at Thomas's back, finger on the trigger, ready. They reached the barn, and Thomas opened the door. Inside, everything seemed normal. Tobacco leaves hung in neat rows, swaying slightly from the breeze through the open door. No fire, no smoke, just the usual mix of tobacco, dust, and old wood. Crenor stepped inside, holding his lantern high. "What the hell are you doing, boy? There's nothing here." Thomas pointed to the back of the barn, toward the storage area, his face still full of panic, gestures frantic. Crenor walked that way, boots echoing on the wooden floor, lantern casting chaotic shadows. Thomas didn't follow. He stepped out and closed the door, dropping a heavy wooden beam across it, normally used to keep animals out in winter. The barn was now locked from outside. He heard Crenor shouting, pounding the door, but Thomas was already walking away, calm under the moonlight. Behind him, in the storage area, the leaking lantern had finally caught the oil puddle. Flames spread fast, igniting the rags, straw, and wood. Within minutes, the fire climbed the back wall, reaching the dried tobacco leaves. The leaves caught fire like paper, sending embers toward the roof. The blaze spread horizontally, racing along the racks, devouring everything. Crenor smelled smoke before he saw fire. He stopped pounding, spun around, lantern casting wild shadows. At the far end of the barn, an orange glow spread, growing with a sound like wind rushing through trees, the sound of fire consuming dry wood and tobacco. He ran to the back, hoping to stop it. But the flames were too high, too hot. He stomped with his boots, but the fire had caught the leaves, sending embers upward. Heat was unbearable, smoke thick, hard to breathe, hard to see. Crenor ran back to the door, slammed his W8 against it. But the beam held. He shouted for help, voice lost in the roar of fire. Smoke filled the barn, thick and choking, heat blistering his skin. Flames spread across the ceiling, consuming support beams. Desperate, he looked for another way out. Windows were too high, too small. The loading door at the back was chained from outside. He was trapped. Fire raced along the walls, devouring tobacco, wood, beams. Lungs burned, eyes streaming with smoke, skin blistering. He slammed the door again and again, shoulder numb, arms weak. Then, through smoke and flames, he saw something that froze his blood. Near the back, in the shadows just beyond the fire's reach, stood a figure. A young man, dark eyes, expressionless. Thomas, impossible. Thomas was outside. Thomas had locked him in. Crenor blinked, trying to clear smoke from his eyes. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Had it been real? Or smoke, fear, whiskey playing tricks? He would never know. Moments later, the roof collapsed, showering sparks and burning debris on him. One final scream before flames consumed him. Thomas sat on his cabin steps as the barn fell. He felt the ground shake, saw sparks shoot skyward like a fountain of fire. Around him, people came out, shouting, pointing, faces lit by orange glow. Within minutes, everyone was awake. They formed a bucket brigade from the well, passing water hand to hand, but it was useless. Fire was too fierce. All they could do was stop, spreading. Ruth found Thomas in the chaos. She grabbed his arm, eyes searching his face. She didn't need to ask. She could see the truth in his eyes. "Where's Crenor?" She signed, hands shaking. Thomas pointed at the burning barn. Ruth's face went pale. "Is he?" Thomas nodded. For a long moment, Ruth just stared at him, her mind spinning. Then she made up her mind. She pulled Thomas toward the main house where one of the older women who managed the house was standing on the porch, watching the fire with wide, frightened eyes. "We need to send someone to Richmond," Ruth told the woman, "to let Mr. Hargrove know what happened. Thomas will go." The woman nodded, too shocked to argue. Ruth turned to Thomas and signed quickly, urgently. "Go to Richmond right now. Tell Mr. Hargrove there was a fire. Tell him you don't know where Mr. Crenshaw is. Stay there until tomorrow. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded. He understood. Ruth was giving him an excuse, a reason to be away from the plantation when the fire started. If anyone asked, he had been sent to Richmond to fetch Edmund Hargrove. He couldn't have started the fire because he wasn't there. Thomas left right away, walking down the road toward Richmond in the darkness, the glow of the fire fading behind him. He walked for 3 hours until he reached the edge of the city. Then he found a place to rest, a small grove of trees near the road, and waited for dawn. Back at the plantation, the fire raged through the night. By morning, the tobacco barn was nothing but a smoking ruin, a heap of charred wood and ashes. The other buildings were saved, but the barn was gone, and with it the entire tobacco crop that had been curing inside. And somewhere under the collapsed roof and burned leaves was the body of Virgil Crenshaw. Edmund Hargrove arrived at the plantation around noon on August 14th, having been summoned by Thomas, who had found him at his Richmond townhouse early that morning. Hargrove was shocked and upset by what he saw. The tobacco barn reduced to ashes, the crop destroyed, and his overseer dead. The county sheriff came 3 days later to investigate. His name was William Foster, a man in his 52s with a weathered face and practical manners. He had been sheriff for 20 years and had investigated many fires on plantations across the county. Most were accidents, overturned lanterns, sparks from forges, lightning strikes. A few were deliberate, set by enslaved people as acts of resistance or revenge, but those were usually easy to spot because the perpetrators weren't subtle. Foster first questioned Edmund Hargrove, asking about the plantation's routines, Crenshaw's habits, and any recent problems. Hargrove said Crenshaw had been a good overseer, that tobacco yields had increased under him, and that no major problems had happened that he knew of. Foster then spoke with Ruth, who said Thomas had seen Crenshaw go into the barn carrying a lantern on the night of the fire. She said Thomas had been working late in the carpenter shop and noticed Crenshaw stumbling slightly, as if drunk. A few minutes later, Thomas saw smoke coming from the barn. He ran to get help, but by the time he returned, the fire was too large to control. Ruth then sent him to Richmond to fetch Mr. Harrove. Foster spoke with several other enslaved people, and they all told the same story. Crenshaw had been drinking, gone into the barn to check on the tobacco, and somehow the fire had started. It was a tragic accident, but not unusual. Foster examined the barn's ruins, sifting through ashes for clues. He found the remains of a lantern near the fire's starting point, supporting the story that Crenshaw had been carrying it and accidentally knocked it over. He found Crenshaw's body burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by the pistol he had and the brass buttons from his coat. Foster wrote his report and closed the case. The fire was an accident caused by an overturned lantern. Virgil Crenshaw had died trying to protect his employer's property. It was a tragedy, but no foul play was evident. Crenshaw was buried in the plantation cemetery in an unmarked grave that would be forgotten within a generation. Edmund Hargrove hired a new overseer, a gentler man named Robert Hayes, who didn't use Crenshaw's cruel methods. The tobacco crop was lost, but Harrove had insurance, and he rebuilt the barn and planted a new crop the next spring. Life on the plantation returned to something like normal. The enslaved people went back to their routines, working the fields, tending animals, keeping buildings up. But something had changed. There was now a sense of possibility, a feeling that the old order could be challenged, that men like Crenshaw were not invincible. Then, 3 weeks after the fire, something strange happened. Another fire broke out, this time in one of the slave cabins. It was small and quickly put out, but it made people nervous. The cabin belonged to Peter, one of Crenshaw's favorites, an informer who reported on other enslaved people for small privileges. The fire started in the middle of the night while Peter slept. He woke to find his mattress smoldering, and he managed to put it out before it spread. But the message was clear. Informers were not safe. A week later, another fire appeared in the kitchen house. Again, it was extinguished before causing damage, but the pattern was obvious. Someone was setting fires, targeting specific people and places. Edmund Hargrove became convinced the plantation was cursed. He spent more time in Richmond, leaving the plantation under Robert Hayes's care. Hayes was nervous too. He had heard the stories about Crenshaw, what had happened to him, and didn't want the same fate. He treated the enslaved people fairly, avoiding the cruelty that made Crenshaw so hated. The fires continued, small, contained, never causing major damage but always in unexpected places. The enslaved people whispered among themselves. Some said it was Crenshaw's ghost haunting the plantation. Others said it was divine punishment for past cruelties. But a few people, Ruth, Marcus, Hannah, knew or suspected the truth. Ruth confronted Thomas one evening after supper. "You have to stop," she signed, her hands shaking with fear and anger. "They're going to find out. They'll know it's you." Thomas looked at her with those calm, watchful eyes. "I'm not setting fires," he signed. "Don't lie to me," Ruth signed back. "I know what you did to Crenshaw. I know what's happening now. You have to stop before they catch you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then signed. "I'm not setting fires, but I'm not stopping them either." Ruth didn't understand at first, then she realized what he meant. The fires weren't started by Thomas. They were set by others. Marcus, Hannah, maybe more. People who had seen what happened to Crenshaw and realized fire could be a weapon, a tool of resistance. Thomas hadn't started a rebellion, he had started an idea. And ideas, once planted, are almost impossible to extinguish. Marcus had set the fire in Peter's cabin as a warning. Hannah set the fire in the kitchen house to show even the main house was vulnerable. Others had their own reasons, grievances, and motives. They set small, controlled fires to send messages without causing huge damage. The message was clear. We are not powerless. We can fight back. By spring 1860, Edmund Harrove had enough. He sold the plantation to a buyer from North Carolina and moved Ed permanently to Richmond. The new owner lasted less than a year before selling again. Unable to handle the constant fires, the fear, and the sense the land itself was hostile, the plantation changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War began in 1861. By the war's end in 1865, the main house had burned down in another mysterious fire, large enough to destroy the whole structure. The property was abandoned, land divided and sold. Thomas lived to see emancipation. He was 24 when the war ended. Young, strong and watchful, he left Virginia and traveled north, settling in Philadelphia, where he worked as a carpenter. He married Clara, also deaf, and they had 3 children. He built a good, free life, one he could never have imagined on Harrow Plantation. He never spoke of August 14, 1859. He never told anyone he had locked Virgil Crenshaw in the burning barn. He carried that secret until his death in 1903 at age 62. But the story survived, passed down by descendants of the enslaved at Harrow, whispered in kitchens and parlors, retold until it became part history, part legend. Some versions said Thomas had magical powers to start fires with his mind. Others said he made a deal with the devil. The oldest, closest to truth version said simply Thomas was a young man pushed too far, who saw too much cruelty and decided that if the law wouldn't give him justice, he would take it himself. The land where Harrow Plantation once stood is still in Virginia's Tidewater region, about 40 miles south of Richmond. The main house is gone, the tobacco barns are gone, the slave cabins are gone. Only a stone foundation half buried in weeds and a small cemetery remain, where Virgil Crenshaw's unmarked grave is long forgotten. But on certain nights when the wind is right, people nearby say they can still smell smoke. And if you stand very still, listening carefully, you can almost hear it. You can almost hear someone banging on a door, trying desperately to escape, their voice swallowed by the roar of the flames. This story reminds us that history is never as simple as it looks in textbooks. The line between victim and oppressor, between justice and revenge, is often so blurred that it's hard to tell them apart. Thomas was a young man who had been denied every kind of justice, every bit of protection, every ounce of humanity, and so he took matters into his own hands, in the only way he knew how. Was what he did justified, or did he become the very thing he was fighting against? These are questions with no easy answers, questions that each of us must answer in our own way. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Thomas was right in what he did, or did his actions cross a line that should never be crossed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next one.